The tide is out. In the quiet it leaves behind, old things surface, stories that only show themselves when the world goes still. This is low tide lore. Tonight, the old drove roads where black cattle rise from mountain waters. Settle in and let the waters stay low a while. Start at a market town on a Tuesday in October, somewhere along the border. The air already thick with dung and breath and the particular racket of 100 cattle who do not want to be standing where they are standing. An auctioneer's voice carries over all of it in a register no ordinary speech uses, fast and flat and rising at the end of each number, and men in heavy coats lean on the rail and say nothing for long stretches, then everything at once. This is where a drove ends, technically, the beasts sold here having walked the length of Wales to reach this pen. But it is easier and truer to the road itself to begin instead at the far end of that walk, where the herds first gather. Begin at the edge, then where the hills have not yet decided to be hills at all, still soft and low, still cut through with hedgerows and the ordinary business of lowland farms. This is the border country between England and Wales, Radnorshire on the old maps, and it is here that the drove roads start, or rather, where they stop being lanes and become something else. A drove road does not look like much from a car window. A wide green track, sometimes 40 feet across, running straight up a hillside where no modern road would bother to go. It was built wide on purpose. Not for wheels, but for hooves, hundreds of them at a time, and for the geese that came behind the cattle with tar smeared thick on their feet to save the wear. The geese went last in the line, thousands of them, some seasons, herded by boys with long willow switches, and a goose with tarred feet and a coat of sand pressed into the tar could walk further than anyone expected a goose to walk at all. They moved slower than the cattle and were driven separately for that reason, arriving at the same markets a week or two behind the herds, footsore, thinned by the road, but alive, which was the entire point of the tar. Every autumn for something near 300 years, the herds came down out of these hills toward the markets of England. Welsh Black cattle mostly, small and dark and hardy, walked the whole way on their own legs. A drover might move 100 head or more, with 2 or 3 men on foot and a corgi at the heel of the slowest cow, a dog bred low and close to the ground so a kick would pass clean over its back. The men carried cudgels of hazel or blackthorn, more for balance on the long climbs than for any fight, and a document called a drover's license, without which the law called them vagrants. They dressed for weeks on the hill rather than for any single day of it. A heavy wool coat that did for both rain and cold, a broad hat that shed water off the brim, and stockings knitted thick enough to wear through twice before the season ended. Follow the road up now, out of the hedged fields, past the last gate that still has a name painted on it, and into the open hill. The track is banked on either side here, turf walls built up over generations of hooves passing the same line. So the road sits slightly below the level of the moor, like a shallow trench of grass. Every few miles, a stand of Scots pine breaks the skyline, planted deliberately, dark and tall against the paler upland grass. A signal from a distance that said, "Here is water, here is rest, here is an inn." The first of these stood near the parish boundary, a low building of stone with a yard big enough to hold 2 herds without mixing them. Walls scored white where generations of horns had rubbed the render thin. Inside, a fire that was never let go out between September and November, because the men coming off the hill were wet to the knee, and the cattle in the yard needed no less warmth than the men. The innkeeper's wife kept a tally of every herd that passed, notched on a stick or scratched in chalk on the door frame, and she knew every drover's face better than her own husband's ledger did. There is a particular sound this house still seems to hold if you sit in it long enough. Wind working at the eaves, the low complaint of old timber, and under it, almost too steady to notice, the fire settling in the grate. It is the sound of every night these men had on the road for 200 years, repeated so often it wore a groove into the house the same way the road wore a groove into the hill. Push on, now, further in. The hedges are long gone. Even the dristone walls give up after a while and let the moor run unbroken to the next ridge. The road narrows here and steepens, climbing the Kerry Ridge or one of its cousins. Tracks with names like Ford y Porthmon still marked faint on the old survey sheets, the Drover's Road, plain as that. A herd on this ground moved perhaps 12 miles a day, no faster, because a cow driven hard loses weight. And weight was the entire point of the journey. The drovers timed it by the grass and the water, not by the clock, resting where both were good and pushing on where neither was. And an experienced man could read a whole day's route in the shape of a valley. They carried more than beasts. A drover leaving the hills often carried the district's money with him too, folded into a coat lining, entrusted by farmers who had no bank nearer than a day's ride. Some of them became bankers outright. A drover from Landovery is remembered, in record this time, and not only in story, for founding a bank whose notes bore the printed image of a black ox, so that men who could not read could still trust the paper. The road climbs harder now, and the light changes with it, thinner, more given to sudden cloud, the kind of hill weather that arrives from one side of the valley while the other side stays clear. There were rules for the road that had nothing to do with any council or landlord. A drover did not count his herd twice in one day, for luck's sake, and did not sell the last beast of a drove if he could help it, for the same reason unstated. Nor did he like to pass a certain field near dusk without lifting his hat to it, an old habit worn smooth of its original meaning, the way a habit will outlast the story that made it. The second inn, deeper in, kept no ledger at all. Payment there was often made in salt or tobacco rather than coin, because coin was scarce this far from any market town. Its fire, like the first, never went dark in the droving months, and its beams were black with 200 years of that same smoke, so black that a hand laid flat against them came away marked. The room there was smaller than the first, low enough that a tall man ducked without thinking, and the benches ran the length of both walls, so that strangers ate elbow to elbow whether they wished to or not. A drover who slept there once a year for 30 years might never learn the innkeeper's given name, only his trade name, passed down the same as the inn itself, father to son, the way the road was passed down too. The valleys narrow further still, as the road bends south and west, folding into the high country under what the maps now call the Black Mountain, though there is no single mountain there, only a long, dark wall of them. Few roads go where this one goes. Most drove roads by now have bent toward the border towns, toward Hereford or Kington, chasing the English markets. This one keeps climbing instead, toward the emptiest part of the range. It was on this stretch, or one very like it, that the older drovers said the herd itself grew quiet, cattle that had lowed and shuffled all week going silent for the last few miles before a particular CWM. The wind changes too on this last approach, dropping low and cold off the scree even in fair weather, funneled down through a gap in the ridge that has no name on any map the drovers ever carried. The valley they were quiet for opens suddenly, the way a door opens. The ridge simply steps aside, and there below is a bowl of ground holding a lake, so still it seems to have been poured rather than filled. This is Llyn y Fan Fach. Small as mountain lakes go, black water under a wall of scree, and around it, silence of a particular quality, the kind that makes a person lower their voice without deciding to. There was one more inn here, the last one on this branch of the road, kept for generations by a family who did not advertise it and did not need to, because every drover on this route already knew its door. Its fire is the one this story keeps returning to. Peat rather than wood, burning low and orange and slow, throwing almost no light past its own hearth, so the room stayed dark at the edges no matter the hour. It was here, more than at any other inn on the road, that the story of the lake was told. Not as entertainment exactly, but as something owed to the place, the way grace is owed before a meal. So let it be told here, as it was told there, plainly, as a myth, because that is what it is, and no parish register anywhere claims otherwise. A young farmer of Blaen Sawdde, a real place, still marked on the map at the foot of this valley, was grazing his cattle by the lake one still morning when he saw a woman sitting on the water itself, combing her hair, as calm as if the surface were a stone floor. Her hair was long and dark, the story says, and the comb she used was gold, or looked gold in that light, and she paid the farmer no more attention than she would have paid a heron standing at the shallow end of the lake. He offered her bread, the way a man might offer bread to any stranger found in a lonely place, and she looked at it and refused it, and sank back into the water without a word. His mother told him the bread was baked too hard and sent him back the next day with dough that was barely bread at all, and the woman refused that too, laughing this time as she went under. On the third day, he brought bread that was neither too hard nor too soft, and this time she rose from the water fully and stood on the shore and agreed to be his wife. With her, the story says, came a dowry out of the lake itself, cattle, pale and strange at first glance, that walked up out of the water behind her as calmly as if they had always grazed that shore. She set one condition on the marriage, and it is the part of the story every version keeps, word for word, wherever it is told in these hills. He must never strike her 3 times without cause. Years passed, and it happened as these stories always say it happens. He tapped her once, laughing, to hurry her at a wedding they were leaving. He tapped her again, gently, to wake her at a funeral where she wept, and he thought it improper. The third time was smaller than either, a touch at a christening where she laughed when the room called for tears, and he touched her arm without thinking, the way a person touches another to say, not here, not now. That was enough. She called her cattle by name, the story says, and every beast that had come from the lake with her, and every calf born of them since turned and followed her back down to the water and under it, and did not come up again. The lake closed over all of it, woman and herd both, and the farmer of Blaen Sawdde lived out the rest of his life on the shore of a lake that had taken back everything it had ever lent him. That is the legend told as the fire tells it, unhurried, the same shape it has had for longer than anyone at that hearth could say. Now, set beside it what the record actually holds, because the two do not fully agree, and the honest thing is to say so plainly rather than let them blur together. There was a real family, well attested in Welsh medical history, known for generations as the physicians of Midfi, a village a short walk from this same lake, whose manuscripts of herbal cures survive in libraries to this day. The legend gives them their origin, claiming they were the sons of the farmer and the woman of the lake, given by their vanishing mother a final gift of medical knowledge as she left, so that some good would remain of the marriage. The parish record cannot confirm a lake woman, obviously, and does not try to. What it confirms is the family itself, practicing medicine in this valley from at least the middle of the medieval period, respected, literate, and unusually skilled for such a remote place. Their remedies survive in manuscript, written in Welsh in a careful hand, mixtures of betony and agrimony, of feverfew and comfrey root, dosages set out plainly for conditions the writer clearly expected his reader to recognize without further explanation. They treated wounds, fevers, difficult births, the ordinary catalog of a valley too far from any town to call for help, and their reputation reached, by the account of later scholars, well beyond this one district. Where the two accounts do meet, oddly, is over the cattle. Welsh Black cattle from this district were long said locally to carry lake blood, meaning simply that they were considered an especially fine and hardy strain, and the story explains why a farmer here would want to believe that. It is not a large leap from a farmer proud of his herd to a farmer who tells his neighbors the herd came from somewhere better than any ordinary field, and from there it is an even smaller leap to the lake at the head of his own valley. So the myth may explain the physicians, or the physician's fame may have gathered the myth toward itself over the centuries, the way a good story tends to collect whatever fine thing is nearby and claim it as its own. Either way, drovers moving cattle south from this valley for 2 centuries were, by their own account, moving stock they believed carried something of the lake in it, and treated the herd accordingly on the road. They did not water cattle from this particular lake before a drive, out of some caution nobody could quite explain when asked directly. They watered them from the stream below it instead, close enough for the story, far enough for comfort. And at the last inn, the one closest to the water, a drover setting out before dawn was expected to leave a small piece of bread on the sill outside, unremarked on, never discussed, simply done, the way a person crosses themselves without thinking about why. The innkeeper's family kept this custom long after the droving trade itself had thinned to nothing well into living memory. Bread on the sill each morning, whether or not any herd was passing that week at all. Sit now in that last room, if the house still stands, or imagine sitting in it, because either way, the shape of the evening is the same and has not changed in essentials for a very long time. The peat fire holds its low orange line along the grate. The wind finds the gap under the door and along the eaves, working at the thatch or the slate the way it has worked at this roof every night for as long as the roof has stood. Outside, past the small window, the valley goes down toward the lake in a dark that has no other light in it at all. No farmhouse window, no passing car, only the shape of the water known by memory rather than by sight. A drover in that room, boots off at last, cudgel leaned by the door, would have heard the story told again that night, as he had likely heard it told at that same hearth on some earlier drove, in some earlier year. It would not have troubled him particularly. These were practical men, used to weighing cattle by eye and reading weather off a ridgeline, and a story like this one sat comfortably enough alongside the practical, the way a saint's day sits alongside a market day without either one crowding the other out. What the story gave him, more than any warning, was a reason to look at the lake the next morning with something other than indifference, to notice the stillness of it, to walk his herd past it a little slower than the ground alone required. That, in the end, may be the whole use of a myth told at a drover's hearth, not to frighten a man off a road he has to travel anyway, but to make him travel it paying attention. The road itself continued past this valley, further still, over the last ridge and down into Carmarthenshire, toward markets that no longer exist in any form the drovers would recognize. The railway did to this trade what it did to so much else in these hills. By the later 1800s, A cattle wagon could move a herd to England in a single day, what had taken a drover the better part of a fortnight on foot. The inns emptied gradually rather than all at once, first losing the big autumn droves, then the smaller local ones, until many of them simply became farmhouses again. The wide yards turned over to hay or left to nettle. A few still stand along this road with a sign or a name that gives them away. A drover's arms here, a stone marked with an ox and a date there, and the odd Scots pine still standing sentinel long after the door it once marked has gone. The road itself is easier to lose than the inns, grown over in places, plowed through in others. But a walker who knows to look for it can still find the turf banks running straight up a hillside where no farm track has any business going. A shepherd working this ground today will still call a certain gap in the wall the drover's gate, though no drove has used it in 100 years, the name outliving every man who ever walked a herd through it. And the lake keeps its silence regardless of any of that, unbothered by the traffic that no longer passes it, holding the same still black surface it held for the farmer of Blaen Sawdde, whoever he actually was, if he existed at all as a single man rather than as a name gathered around an old story. The physicians of Midfi are certain enough. Their manuscripts sit in libraries now, catalogued, dated, translated, no myth required to explain their skill, only patience and generations of careful practice passed from father to son in a remote valley that needed its own doctors because no other doctor would come so far. The lake woman is not certain at all and was never meant to be. She belongs to the fire, not to the register, and the two have coexisted in this valley for so long that separating them entirely would leave the place a little thinner than it actually is. If you stood at that hearth tonight, the fire would still be peat, low and orange, and the wind would still be finding the same gap at the eaves it has always found, and the lake would still be exactly where the road has always led. No drove has passed this way in a very long time. No herd waits quiet in the yard at dusk, but the road remains where it was cut, and the lake remains where it was set, and somewhere between the two, the story keeps its own kind of watch. That is where this road ends, not at a market, not anymore, but at a small, dark water under a wall of scree, with a fire behind you and the wind still working, patient as it has always been, at the eaves of the last house on the hill. The tide is turning now. What surfaced tonight will slip back under, the way these stories always do. But the water keeps them. It always carries them back. If you want to be here when it pulls away again, follow along, and the next one will find you. Until then, rest easy. The water remembers.